Professor Dizon, welcome back to our podcast. Good to see you after almost 9 months, right?
Yeah, I think so. So it's very good to see you as well.
Thank you. Well, let's start things off with your guests. You host many famous guests. How would you briefly describe their thoughts on the situation in Europe and the world today? And how would you describe the times we live in?
Well, the guests I try to bring on are various experts. So I find it who obviously have opinions and perspectives which should be included in the discussion. But I noticed that they're not. So for example, if you have people like Jack Matlock, who was a former US ambassador negotiating an end to the Cold War, he has a lot of relevant experiences, but why aren't we including him? If we have a former director at the CIA for Russia analysis, why don't we listen to him? And what we see is if they don't have the right conclusions which support essentially prolonging the war, they don't reach the right conclusions, they don't push the correct narratives, they're excluded from the conversation. So my main objective is to be able to bring in the other side of the coin as well, because my main concern is that we have the discussion has been artificially divided into two categories, that either you support everything that NATO is doing, so NATO has to expand, we have to send more weapons, we should never pick up the phone and talk to Moscow, all these things. Either you align with this. If you question it, then the first question would be, well, why would you try to justify what Russia's doing? Why do you support this? Don't the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves? This will be a comeback if you say perhaps we shouldn't send weapons. Why? Because you expand the war, we might have a nuclear exchange, but then always the assumption is you have two positions: either support what we're doing or you're with the enemy. This is it. So I would like, and the only reason why this propagandistic approaches work is because we exclude very important voices from the conversation. So again, that's my goal, to bring them back in so we can function as an actual open democratic society.
Are we facing new wars? Venezuela, Middle East. Now we can see that the Russian army is advancing in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think there's wars everywhere. The US now is standing off the coast of Venezuela, planning an attack. There's also a possibility of the hostilities then going into Colombia. You have, well, in the Middle East, there might be another attack on Iran, which would go very different this time. There's, of course, possibilities that the war against Lebanon will be expanded, and we will use our new Syrian proxy to enter Lebanon. The peace in Gaza is not going to hold. I think most people recognize this. And obviously, a key problem is that in Europe, we bet everything on this proxy war in Ukraine. As we're losing this war, desperation sets in. And when politicians are desperate, they often do very foolish things. So we're now talking about long-range direct strikes on key political, maybe commercial, as well as military targets deep inside Russia, launched by Westerners. That is our soldiers, our weapons, our targeting, which is a direct war. So we risk now a direct NATO-Russia war because the Russians are desperate to restore their deterrent. Again, across the world, it seems that war has become the first solution, which is a very tragic place to be. If you also remember the optimism we had, well, maybe not in your region, but in the early 90s, the assumption we would have perpetual peace, how this turned into I guess perpetual war that would just keep having, and I think it goes back to the idea, it's linked to the optimism we had in the 90s. I think there's a whole idea that the world would be fundamentally transformed, the whole world would unite under liberal democratic values and Western leadership, and our old way of looking at security and peace in the world changed, because in the past, especially during the Cold War, we realized that conflicts derived from security competition. And we recognized if we want to have peace, we have to reduce the security competition, make sure that our opponents, be it the Soviets, Yugoslavs, that they don't feel that much threat. If they don't feel threat, then they will be able to reduce the way they pose threat to us as well. All of this is gone now. Now the world is, peace is created by having democracy, and democracy is delivered with through military force. This is why we're giving peace prizes to, to the Venezuelan opposition activists who are saying, well, democracy brings peace and the US Army brings democracy, so please invade us and attack us. This will bring peace. I mean, this is kind of the mentality we have now, I think.
It is just like Orwell's world.
Very much. War is peace. And
Yes.
well, at some point, yeah, the NATO Secretary General, former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, almost engaged in copyright infringements when he said, weapons are the path to peace. If you talk to the opponent, then this is you're emboldening them. This is the new logic. It's very frightening. And the more these people are convinced in their own virtue and how good they are and how evil their opponents are, the more vile and destructive policies they push, and the less opposition or dissent they actually accept at home. So, I used to teach security strategy. I always made a point to my students: don't hate your opponents. The more you dehumanize them, the worse your policy is going to end up being. Your analysis will be terrible, and your policies will be terrible, and you'll end up in a situation much like where the Europeans are today.
Well, speaking about the wars, how will the war in Ukraine end, and when? What do you think?
Well, I think it's too many unknown variables just yet. I think the overall path of the war is following a very predictable path. That is, it's a war of attrition. That is a war where one side will exhaust the other. This is logical because, especially always since 2022, when we say that the Western leaders said as well, this war will be ended on the battlefield. We don't want to talk to the opponent. We can't pick up a phone to talk to Moscow. We reject everything they say. Well, then there's only one solution. That is, victory will happen once the enemy has been completely destroyed. When you're dealing with huge countries, Russia's huge, but Ukraine is also a very big country. When you're talking about these big countries exhausting the adversaries, it means hundreds of thousands of deaths. It means economies destroyed, tens of millions fleeing. It's a horrible disaster on many levels. So the overall trend you would look for is the casualty numbers, for example, and you see every month by month the Ukrainian casualties are going up. You see month by month the Russians are building more firepower, better missiles, better drones, and the relative firepower of the Ukrainians are weakening. The Russians are building more air defenses. The Ukrainians are losing their air defenses. So overall, the power is shifting more and more in Russia's favor. Now, the problem then is for the West. We or NATO, this is a proxy war. Once the Ukrainian front lines begin to collapse, this is very problematic. I think the ideal situation for NATO would be to have stagnant front lines where Ukrainians and Russians just bleed each other over years and years. I think that would be an ideal scenario often for NATO. But no, what you're looking at now is we're moving towards a collapse, and the more men and equipment the Ukrainians loses, the more vulnerable they are at the front lines are opening up. And the Russians are further expanding the front lines, which allows them to begin to take advantage of weaknesses in the defenses. They're able to encircle entire cities, huge amount of soldiers. And as then thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are captured or killed in a single surrounded area or deserting, then you see that the situation just goes from bad to worse. So my big question is what's going to happen now? You would think that once it's obvious that the Ukrainian army will collapse, it will be easier to find to accept the Russian terms, and the Russian terms are very harsh, which is why the Ukrainians are very much find it difficult to accept them. But if the Europeans won't let the war come to an end through defeat, they only have one option: escalate, or they can, of course, accept defeat. And it appears that they would like to escalate, but they're not quite sure how yet.
Yeah. European countries you mentioned are becoming increasingly militarized. What will that bring? What will that bring to all of us?
War, I think. It's
only war.
Yeah, well, we're in a very difficult spot now, though. I mean, the wider situation we're at is that the world has become more and more multipolar, which means you have many centers of power. How this translates into the behavior of the different states is for the US, it has other centers of power to worry about. Most importantly for them is East Asia with China and Americas, so their own continent. So that they will want to pivot there because they have fewer relative resources. Now, if they pivot there, they have to pivot away from somewhere. And Europe is of declining interest to them. So the Americans will want to leave. They want to hand over everything to the Europeans. At the same time, the Americans, when you have other centers of power, they would like the Europeans to be more obedient and loyal to the US. That is only by American energy, American technologies. So Europeans should ideally cut themselves off from other centers of power, from Russia, Iran, China, whoever the Americans might be in competition with. So that will make us less prosperous, more dependent on the US, and so economically more vulnerable, but also as the Europeans are left on their own in terms of security after 80 years of security dependence on the US, there's also a need to militarize to be able to take care of our own security. And this is happening at the same time as we're having now going from a proxy war with Russia to what seems more and more like a direct war. So how are the Europeans going to pull this off? We're getting poorer now. Our economies are going south. We're having more pressure to fight war. And we don't want to talk to the Russians. So we can't solve this diplomatically because nobody wants to pick up the phone and call Russia because, it might legitimize Putin or something along these lines. This is kind of the consensus our political establishment has reached. So no, we're in a very, very dangerous spot now. And at the moment, the only strategy appears to be to convince the Americans that they have to re-engage in Europe. So we're having all this, every time we see someone with a hobby drone near an airport, it has to be shown as an evidence of Russia hybrid war because anything that can pull the Americans in. So it's, no, I think I would like to see a strategy for Europe. If our political leaders argue that they have a very convincing strategy, put it forth. Show us what it is. At the moment, they're talking about defeating Russia, the world's largest nuclear power, who considers this to be an existential threat. That is NATO's incursion into Ukraine. This is, it's quite just, it's madness. No one can outline what the plan is. Also, we need technological sovereignty in Europe. We need to develop a digital tech base so we won't have too much dependence on the US. In the past, we used to talk about this. The Europeans were saying, oh, well, we need a strategic autonomy to have European independence. Well, that requires many things. You need technological sovereignty. You need to diversify your foreign trading partners. We're doing exactly the opposite. And also, a first step would be don't have a redivided Europe, which is militarized, because then we will be too dependent on the Americans, just like the Russians will be more too dependent on the Chinese. If we want to have some autonomy and independence, the first thing to do is stop making Europe into a geopolitical chessboard, which allows us to be manipulated by others. But this is what we've done. We created the whole ideology of why the redivision of Europe and remilitarization of Europe is somehow a good thing, good for democracy.
Can the behavior of the EU leaders be rationally explained?
I think not. I think I think there's many things happening. I think there's, as I mentioned, panic that the political West as an entity is breaking up. Because after the Cold War, initially many Europeans, especially the French, were pushing for a multipolar world. They realized this wouldn't happen, and I think many recognized that the best possible outcome then would be, instead of having American unipolarity, we would have the unipolarity of the West standing on two legs, that is the US and the European Union. So this would be a collective hegemon, and this was seen as being beneficial. Now, of course, after 80 years, the Americans are looking at the departing. There's panic, so I can understand the reason behind the panic. But I also think there's something unique about the EU due to the European Union. That is the unity and solidarity of the EU. It's seen as being necessary. And to some extent, I agree. I think we are many smaller countries, medium-sized to small. We need to stand together in order to have a proper voice in the world. But that being said, how do you get 28, 29 countries to align themselves with very different interests? Why would Latvia and Greece have the same foreign policy? It doesn't really make much sense. So how do you unify? Sometimes you can talk about values, but all this means is that every foreign policy issue is framed in terms of freedom or slavery, good or evil. You're not able to do anything then. You can't have a serious discussion in terms of what actually serves our interest. And I think this is something that the Europeans have done, especially since the 90s and onwards. That is, every issue is framed as good or bad. So when the EU expanded, for example, the main idea would be, not everyone would gain the same way. The Germans would benefit more than the French, but it was framed as being about freedom and democracy. And who would oppose freedom and democracy spreading to Eastern Europe? No one. So kind of it had a good way of crushing any dissent, but it also crushed serious discussions about how we would deal with the different economic developments, who would benefit more from the common currency, movements of people, this kind of things. We never really had serious solutions to this. And but again, I'm not going to demonize it. I thought expanding the EU was a good thing. But my point is, we always do these things. We do it with immigration. Either you are tolerant or you hate immigrants and you're a racist xenophobe. That's not a good way to discuss the issue of huge demographic shifts. And we do the same with foreign policy. That is, either you support expanding NATO, blocking all diplomacy, never talk to the opponent, send more weapons. If there's a threat, Russia feels it has to restore its deterrent. Well, by no means, we should never be deterred, because this is blackmail. If there will be nuclear war, well, so be it. We can't allow ourselves to be blackmailed just because Russia has nuclear weapons. This is the kind of logic we have now. So common sense is long gone out the window. And I think everything has to be framed as good versus evil has this purpose to crush all dissent and common sense.
Now, I must ask you why Europe hates Orban.
Yeah, that's a good, that's a great question. I think for many reasons. I think the EU has become a very liberal elitist project where it's no longer defines Europe based on Europe was developed on the liberal nation state. That has two pieces so that balance each other. The nation state is a very conservative construct. It's the idea of the sovereignty of a people based on the common history, language, all of this. And also this has a liberal component that is carved out a significant space for the individual to essentially deviate from that same culture, language, history, and have some sovereignty of the individual. Now, I think that over the past few decades, the liberalism divorced itself from the nation state to some extent. And now we have two different, it's been polarized, where we used to have unity. Because what Orban says today is not that different from what was mainstream European politics a few decades ago. But let's say you have an issue of mass immigration to Europe. The Germans will say, well, we have to open our borders, because what does it mean to be a European? They will define it solely in liberal terms. It means to accommodate refugees, to take into account human rights, it's this kind of stuff. So being European means you take them in. If you're in Budapest, you will say, well, what does it mean to be European? It means we have our own traditions, religion, our cultural heritage, which you have to be able to reproduce. If we take in millions of people from a faraway continent with a different set of religion and culture, then we become less European. So they have completely different conceptions of what it means to be European. But, if you like Orban or not, I tend to like him. But if you don't, you still have to recognize, though, that what he's doing in this era of crushing conformity in Europe, where everyone has to march in line, otherwise the EU might fail. He's actually standing up and speaking on behalf of the national interest of Hungary, what he thinks is a national interest, and he's standing up against the EU blob. And I think, that's quite admirable. Look at the Germans. They're actually a huge country compared to to Hungary, and they're ignoring their own national interests. They can stand next to Biden while he talks about how he's going to blow up their pipeline or at least get rid of it, and they do nothing. They see their energy security being attacked. Their neighbors tell them, well, that's all right, you should apologize for having it built. You see the Americans providing subsidies for poaching their key industries. They do nothing. I mean, this is I would rather have Orban as my president than Chancellor Merz. So.
You recently had the opportunity to ask Russian President Putin about Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Is this a new red flag for Russia? And what I'm actually interested in is this. What is Putin like in these appearances? What are your impressions? Is he arrogant?
No, well, I wouldn't categorize his answer as being arrogant. I think it's more he seems perplexed by why we're going down this path, because well, if you look at Sweden and Finland, why did they join NATO to begin with? It changes the whole security situation, and this is why I also asked him, because I wanted to know how the Russian sides perceive the security dynamics of Europe being changed by them. But he seemed to focus more on this answer about how, like, why this was done, because Finland, they had a war with the Soviets.
Yes.
And in the Winter War, as we know, the Soviets invaded because they feared that Finland could be used as a flank by the Germans to invade the Soviet Union. This was the reasoning. Doesn't mean that it was legitimate or all of this, but this was the reasoning. And of course, during World War II, they did align with Nazi Germany, but after the war, they declared neutrality, and they didn't pose then a threat to the Soviet Union because they couldn't be used as a bridgehead, and the Soviets didn't threaten them, and they through neutrality they prospered greatly, and there was no threats to them. And now they always had a minority of people actually wanting to join NATO. After the Russians invaded Ukraine, there was a natural panic and fear among the population. The polling showed that more people wanted now to join NATO, a majority for the first time. So they rushed the country quickly into NATO because, before the polls would drop down again. And they did the same in Sweden. So Putin's answer to my question was more, why was this necessary? Because now the Russians have to build up their the Leningrad military district along the border of Finland, and the Finns start now to talk about, oh, look, the Russians are building up their military here. You have heard German generals say, oh, this is proof that the Russians have plans after Ukraine to attack NATO. But this is the security competition. If you enhance your security at the expense of another, the other side will then enhance their security, and then you're stuck in a security dilemma where we're heading towards a conflict which probably neither side wanted. No, but I think it's a great concern, at least for me as a Scandinavian, because the history of Russia, ever since the collapse of Kievan Rus in the 13th century, was that they lost all their access to reliable maritime transportation corridors where the ship could sail. And they have three main oceans they can access on their western side. That is European Russia, where most people reside. They have the Arctic, they have the Baltic, and they have the Black Sea. The war in Ukraine has to a large extent been a competition over the Black Sea. This is something both sides have recognized. If you can bring NATO into Odessa and even Crimea, then Russia would be expelled completely from the Baltic Sea, more or less. But now with the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO, it creates huge pressure in the Baltic Sea. You have now politicians across the West talking about the Baltic Sea being a NATO lake. You're having talks about putting more pressure on Kaliningrad. You had the American general talking about that they could invade easily Kaliningrad. You had the former NATO Secretary General arguing that we could put a blockade on St. Petersburg. These are all consequences now of NATO expanding into Finland and Sweden. And of course, you have the Arctic as well. And soon, in the months, if not years ahead, there will be more talk about, well, what about the threats to Lapland? That is the north of Finland. Surely we have to have more NATO military presence, which happens to come very close to Murmansk and Russia's northern fleet. So you can see the security competition coming in the future, and so I think it's my fear is that Scandinavia will become essentially a Ukraine of the North, another front line to be possibly sacrificed.
Soon, or?
Sorry?
Will it be soon, or?
Oh, I would know. I hope not.
Yeah, I hope too.
But you already see U.S. military bases being
Yes, I
opening
know.
up across all of Scandinavia. Most of Scandinavia used to be neutral. Norway was always a part of NATO since the beginning, but it was considered to be NATO light. It meant they did not accept the British and American ships up in the high north. They didn't want any foreign troops or bases permanently on its soil. So it made itself. The main idea was we wanted a deterrent against the Soviets, but we didn't want to be a threat against Russia. Well, these days we were not even allowed to say that NATO can be considered a threat. So all of this is out the window. Every recognition of the security dilemma, all of it's out the window. It's just a good guy and a bad guy, and so there's no security competition. All you do is put more weapons pointing at the bad guy, and they're deterred. And this is the recipe for security.
Professor, let's talk about nuclear weapon. These are the times when nuclear weapons are being tested. First by Russia, then Trump announced it too. Is it a serious warning or just flexing?
I think a bit of both. I think for the Russians, their main concern has been that they let their deterrent slip. That is, during the Cold War, both sides were deterred. They were careful not to step over certain red lines. And if you remember in the beginning of the war, after the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2022, there was a lot of caution in the West. Let's not send armored like tanks, Abrams, that would be too much. HIMARS, that would be too much. Then you had Biden saying, oh, we can't send F-16s, that would mean World War III. Well, look where we are now. We are talking about American soldiers pressing the button, launching American missiles, which are guided by American satellites to strike targets which have been picked by American generals in Russia. So we are attacking Russia. This is a direct war now between NATO and Russia. And there's zero concern. Anyone who argues that perhaps we should not attack the world's largest nuclear power, well, then you would get these nonsense comments. Oh, well, Ukraine has the right to defend itself. I mean, that has nothing to do with it. Yes, they have every right to defend themselves, but America attacking Russia directly, that puts us on the path to nuclear Armageddon. So that's a very different thing. But again, this is how discussion goes now. So anyways, I think the Russians want to restore their deterrent. So how do they do this? They change their nuclear doctrine. They put some nukes also in Belarus just to make sure that they don't become a target for NATO. And then now they have many new weapons. The Poseidon, the big almost like underwater missile, or almost like a nuclear loaded sub is this can create this nuclear tsunami waves to flush entire coastlines. This is kind of a horrible weapon, almost like a doomsday weapon. You have the Oreshnik missile, which is a conventional weapon, but still, being hypersonic, it functions as a tactical nuclear weapon almost in terms of the destructive power. And now you have the new missile the Russians came out with the Burevestnik missile, which is nuclear powered, meaning that it can just fly forever essentially, and makes it very hard to intercept. So you're having all these new weapons come out, and the point is to deter. And the Russians also changed their nuclear doctrine, saying that if you attack us with even conventional weapons, or if you attack us through you're supporting a party such as Ukraine, attacking us through them, then we will consider that an attack by the nuclear power. So they made it they prepared themselves for going up the escalation ladder. So now they will essentially lay down some red lines, and if they are crossed, the Russians will start then to retaliate. So I think it's very reasonable to expect a very dangerous escalation and a possible major war coming, which will also be fought on European soil. At least the missiles will arrive here. And I think Trump has responded the way he always does. He wants he wants to be able to dictate, say, this is the way it is. Everyone should fear America. But it's I think his main weakness. He overestimates the strength of America now. He shows this with the trade war with the Chinese. He overestimates the economic power of America, and he shows it in the war against Russia that they don't have escalation dominance in the military sphere either. So I think what will Trump do? What does he do? And because his only game card is or playing game to play is that he puts maximum pressure and then offers a carrot. So, she is his best friend, Putin is best friend, but if you cross me, then I'll be your worst enemy. This is the game he's playing. Well, he's essentially run into a wall here because the Russians aren't going to back down from this and the Chinese won't back down. So we could be heading towards war, which is why at the moment, when great powers begin to flaunt their nuclear weapons, Trump starts to talk about nuclear testing, is to strike some fear into the hearts of your opponents. And you usually don't want nuclear powers to speak in this way.
Dangerous times, but you mentioned Trump. Trump and Xi recently met. What will that bring to us? Who will be satisfied, and who will get the short end of the stick?
Well, probably we're gonna have to see who has most of the power. And I think in that trade relationship, the Chinese, they have a technological sovereignty. They can sustain themselves. They do everything from having the mines, processing the material coming out of the mines, then including the rare earth minerals, which I think got somewhere 95% of some of the rare earths. They're doing the processing. You're having all the way up to the technological innovations where they control this as well. So this is they have a lot of self-sufficiency. So they have the production power, they're the factory of the world. So they're producing the stuff. They're also the creditor of the world. They're the one with all the money lending. So it's very hard for the United States. They're now $38 trillion in the hole in terms of national debt. They don't really produce that much anymore. In terms of having factories and their technological leadership, while in many areas is still there, it's slipping quite fast. So they're not in a great place to have this economic war. And when the Chinese retaliated by putting restrictions on rare earth minerals, they kind of proved that point. And because without antimony, you can't rebuild the US military, and very basic components you need for any modern industry. So I think the Chinese are holding most of the cards, but they don't want to overplay their card either, because once an economic war goes bad, it can be escalated into the military sphere. And then the Americans can use Taiwan, of course, to put pressure on China and start some escalation. When you have great powers, even if it's economic or military, the objective shouldn't be to defeat your opponent. It's great powers do dangerous things when they're threatened. The goal should be to find a way of coexisting. And hopefully there's. I don't think one side has to fold completely. I think if the Chinese and Americans sit down, they can find some way of renegotiating the relationship. But I think the US should be more realistic about what they can achieve, because the idea that they can restore their dominance, I think, is over. If they want to negotiate being one among equals, that is one among the great powers, then I think the Chinese, they will meet a much more friendly China who's willing to work with them. But they're not going to subordinate themselves to the US.
Professor, you recently returned from Belarus, right? What is the situation in Belarus?
Well, they're also stuck a bit in, they had less to do with this current conflict or war we have, but they got stuck in the middle nonetheless. They are, union state with the Russians. They are, of course, they're on the front line. They're very dependent on Russia. They would like to diversify their economic ties, but the Europeans have cut all ties with them. So now diversification essentially means, instead of relying 100% on Russia, means to look towards Asia, Africa, and this is what they're doing. They're diversifying in a big way. So I was there for the third year in a row for the Eurasia Security Forum. Again, if you're in the West, you should applaud this. You want, you don't want Belarus to 100% depend only on Russia because they would then be more or less absorbed. So you want them to diversify, and that's what they're going for, having one third, Russia, maybe one third China, and one third the rest. But no, it's an interesting position they're at. But of course, they're stuck in a very hostile relationship with their Western borders, with Western neighbors. So when I went there now, that was last week, it was you now have this problems between Belarus and Lithuania. So they actually closed the borders, which added another 8-hour drive for me because I had to drive up through Latvia to go down to Minsk. So and the same way on the way back. So it extended it quite dramatically. But no, I think yeah, you had the delegation there from Hungary, as always, the foreign minister. He's been there every time over the past 3 years. I think it's quite interesting, and I think more Europeans should appear there as well because it reflects how the world is changing. That is, in the 1990s, America was the only game in town. If you wanted to develop economically, you would look towards Washington, do as you're told, more or less. But in these days, in a multipolar world, if you want to prosper, diversify your ties. And again, the people want to, demonize the Belarusians, but when the Americans recently now reached out and argued in favor of improving relations, restoring diplomatic ties and cooperate, the Belarusians were more than happy. They're very enthusiastic now. In my opinion, they might be a bit too enthusiastic, given how deceptive Trump could be. But it is good, and I think they should reach out because the ticket in a multipolar world is not to align yourself in blocks where you exclude yourself and from some parts of the world and subordinate yourself to others. They should work with China, the US, the Europeans, the Indians, the Russians. This is good for them, and that's what they want to do. Diversify for economic prosperity and political autonomy. Most of the world is moving in this direction. My great dream for Europe is that we should do the same. We should work with all centers of power. If not, we end up where we are now, where we only have the US to trade with, which makes us excessively dependent. So when Trump calls von der Leyen, snaps his finger, she has to come running to his golf course in Scotland and sign whatever papers he puts in front of her. This is going to be a disaster for Europe. So no, I think we should overcome some of our Cold War mentality. There's nothing inherent reason why we can't get along with Belarus. I mean, for God's sake, it's in the Cold War we had actual problems, two centers of power, two incompatible ideologies. What is it that we're complaining about Belarus today? What is so bad? We didn't agree with the elections weren't free and fair. Okay, but we still have to go on a war footing. It's very unnecessary. I think we're not achieving any of the objectives we have through these aggressive ways. So I think dialogue would be much more beneficial.
Beneficial, yeah. Do you have some final thoughts before we wrap this video up? I would like to hear it.
Yeah. No, I'm hoping that we would become less militaristic in Europe. We used to think peaceful means for peaceful ends. At least me, I'm from the country I'm from is Norway. We always consider ourselves a peace nation. But the reason we're a peace nation is we never sent weapons to conflicts at war. We always believe that if a conflict breaks out, the first thing you have to do is set up diplomacy. Now I see the exact opposite thing. And but we still think of ourselves as a peace nation. But in the past, peace was based on this. Peaceful means to peaceful ends. Now peace means that, well, the world is divided between democracies and authoritarians. If we just topple the governments, invade them or bomb them, then we can bring democracy and then we'll have peace. So we created a very militaristic view of the world, and there's no dissent. If you believe in free speech, if you do believe that you have the best policies, that this is the path to peace, to continue to insist on fighting a war which can't be won, expanding NATO, which can't happen anyways, or have a discussion or accept some dissent, have a debate. the fact that any dissent is now just smeared as being a pro-Russian talking point, which we have is dangerous and have to be censored, it shows how insecure we are, that we have to censor all news, for example, coming from Russia, that we have to ban, not allow people to cross borders anymore. We can't fly into Russia. I mean, this is, at least in the first Cold War, we had some confidence that we were on the right side. We could afford listening to the other side. We could afford to let our people travel there. And we were convinced that we were on the right side of history. I don't feel that confidence anymore, though.
Professor, thank you very much for your time and for this interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you once again.